So good evening. Welcome to Cocktail, D'Amore, and Conversation. My name is Ben Miller. I am a member of the board of the Schwules Museum, the Queer Museum here in Berlin. And as you can probably hear, not German, I'm from the United States. I've actually been living in Berlin this weekend for exactly 5 years, I realized about 10 minutes ago. So, yay.
Well done.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm João Florêncio. I don't live in Berlin. I live in the UK, and I'm an academic, as you do, working mostly on queer visual culture and pornography. So there's a kind of a thread that will come through. Also some stuff on chemsex and sex cultures. So that's what I do.
So this is a 2-day event. Some of you may already know that. Some of you may be joining us tomorrow. Am I still on? Good.
Yes.
Some of you may be joining us tomorrow evening as well. The way that both nights are made up of a combination of music, as you just heard, and conversations and film screenings. And so tonight we're going to start with a conversation about chemsex practices, and then we'll be showing some video art, a series of films, and we have a reading as well. And then we'll close with a documentary short, and then have a conversation about that whole kind of screening chunk at the end. I think it's pretty obvious by now this is a casual evening, so please join, leave, pass in, pass out, take a moment, have a drink.
Don't pass out.
Well, don't pass out, but you know what I mean. If you haven't already figured it out, there are restrooms all the way down at the bottom of the hill to the left, but do not drink the water that comes out of that tap. I think that's all we have to say at the moment. So
we just need to say a bit about what's the aim of this.
Oh, that's right, we do.
Yeah. So maybe we'll just say it. So we want to thank also G&G, Giacomo and Giovanni, because they asked us to put this together.
Thank you.
And I think what our idea was really to think about contemporary queer cultures broadly, but also to kind of think about what's happening today, but give a sense of like history, and also kind of possible future challenges, what lies ahead. To think also about the pandemic. To think about how the pandemic impacted queer cultures also in Berlin and elsewhere, and maybe touch upon some of the recent news around potentially kind of racism in the scene, which we'll kind of try to address a bit more tomorrow. Today we'll be focusing on queer bodies, on sex and queer bodies, on drugs and queer bodies, to think about what sex and drugs do to us that is pleasurable, that is kind of affirming, and to kind of also engage with you and talk about what are the challenges, how do we live with those things, which, by the way, you may have received an email because we're talking about chemsex first, and because we will be filming questions. There's a kind of a website, and Ben has some kind of instructions, so you can also ask questions anonymously via the website, and we just read them on our smartphones.
Yeah, I'll pass this out. So basically,
if you don't want to be kind of heard, or if you want to ask something you're not comfortable being heard or seen asking.
So will I pass these out? Do you want to introduce the first panel and our first guest?
Yeah. So
Great.
Where is Tut? Come in. This is like the closest we'll get to like a TV chat show.
Yeah, I think so, definitely.
I know.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Tonight
We should
I'm
have
bringing the
dancers. Maybe I'll ask you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, maybe sit down as well.
Tell us a bit about you.
So my name is Tut. I'm an Israeli living here in Berlin for about 10 years now. I've also been doing drugs, having sex, participating in all these kind of queer and kink sex spaces for maybe about double that time. And I was always kind of drawn to the meta aspect of things, not only doing the drugs, participating in these kind of spaces, but also asking why we do it and how we do it and how maybe we can do it in the best way to empower ourselves. And that led me also to doing a lot of harm reduction and risk management work in the queer community. And also, I guess, to this chat that we're going to have here.
Yeah, so we thought about doing this conversation, obviously, Tut working on the ground. And I think it's important to have people who work on the ground because, I mean, not that I don't have any experience of these things, but I think as an academic, what kind of interests me about chemsex, on the one hand, is how chemsex is often written about in the media as just something that is completely negative, that is about queer people and gay men in particular, in kind of media news stories, some kind of death wish or like death drive, or kind of also called kind of internalized homophobia, as well as to kind of medicate trauma or whatever. And while that may be the experience of some people, I think it's also important to think about people who engage in sex on drugs, who may do it for exploratory or affirming ways. And I think there's a kind of an imbalance when we see these stories in the media. And again, I live in the UK, and there was that infamous documentary called Chemsex a few years ago that came out with obviously Vice, obviously directed by two straight men, and immediately triggered a whole shitstorm of news stories about gay men are killing themselves. And obviously I have lots of issues with that documentary, I don't want to go into it, but I think it'd be important to actually understand how or why are kind of queer people and trans people or gender non-conforming people attracted to drug use during sex, right? What does this do for us? That may actually be a way for us to kind of explore who we are, but also what kind of we can become and what our bodies can do. And so that was really the kind of the framing of that I wanted to kind of start with. So this idea of like potentially, chemsex as like a creative practice, rather than just a practice of like self-medication or like kind of management of pain and trauma.
Yeah, and I think here there is two really main things to look at. The first is maybe moving away from this dichotomy of good and bad use and seeing more of varied reasons that can happen simultaneously for why people are using drugs or engaging in these spaces. And the second is really how we can focus on this. I was trying to think of how to really call it, and what came to my mind was inhibition as empowerment. How do we focus on this part of drug use, of chemsex, that does create a lot of positive impact on people's lives and on people's worlds, and allows them to experiment with their own agenda, with their own bodies, with their own context among their friends, and maybe allows them to do that in a way that can create a wave in their world and bring that identity to be something that can also be done in a non-drug context.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, and then there's also the issue of chemsex and chemsex parties. Is it just about the sex, or actually is also about forms of sociability with people around you? Do you, if you engage in chemsex parties in people's apartments, are people just having sex all the time, or actually you also connecting with different forms of intimacy that is not just about sex? And I'm really particularly interested in that in relation to accessibility of queer spaces, or kind of, again, maybe not so much in Berlin, but looking at the UK, how expensive it is to go out, how many queer spaces are closing down, and maybe actually these chemsex parties are ways in which people can still come together, can still feel they are part of some kind of community, because they don't have access to the few or increasingly few and increasingly expensive queer spaces that still exist because of gentrification. And I know gentrification is also kind of a big deal in Berlin. And again, we'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. But so I'm also interested in kind of having a sense, and maybe you'll know more about that. What is the kind of the ecology or the kind of the geography of chemsex in Berlin? Because one of the things that I found quite interesting in is the amount of, say, G consumption that I see in Berlin, and that is maybe not framed as chemsex. So maybe people think about chemsex immediately as consumption of crystal meth and less consumption of G. So I'm also interested in if you move from one city to another, where do people draw the boundaries? You know, what kinds of drugs are okay for you and your kind of morals and sense of like ethics to do, but then where do you draw the line and where do you start judging people about the drugs they do? Because G and crystal meth in the UK, you know, are all part of the same environment, but I feel that here a lot of people do G, but they would draw the line at crystal meth and jump onto judging people that do crystal meth, right?
I think a lot of the what maybe you would think of as chemsex parties that are happening here are not something that the participants of would immediately think of as chemsex parties, and I think that's both because of the drugs, the different drugs that are used. So also G in this case, and not so much crystal meth. But I think also because there is a lot of focus on maybe this kind of bonding that happens alongside the sex. On one side, very aggressive, very in-your-face sexuality. On the other hand, people coming out and feeling as a very cohesive group. And this is something that is undeniable, that people feel later that this is their chosen family, that this is the people they can rely on. Whether that's true or not, whether this builds actual community or not is already a different story, maybe a more complex one, but it's definitely clear that the people that are engaging in it in Berlin really want to feel part of something. Mm-hmm. And these, you would say chemsex parties, maybe here people would prefer to say after hours or house parties or give it a different kind of name. But I think for a lot of people, it's this kind of place to come and find community and this very early tribal sense of lack of inhibition.
Yeah, and I mean, we do have, I don't know if you're kind of willing to answer our questionnaire, but we'd be really interested to have a sense if you have your smartphones on.
Should we tell them how to do it? Yeah.
Did you just not pass it around?
I did pass it around, yeah.
Yeah, so if you go to that website.
Oh no.
The code didn't work. Try again, because maybe I had to play it and I just played it.
Maybe because of the printing, but the URL is fairly short. And the way that this will work is if you answer questions here, there's a few multiple choices, and I'll be able to see your answers as they come in and sort of communicate them. And then also, if you can also write written questions, and I can see those come in as well.
There's a Q&A section.
And ask them on your behalf.
There's a Q&A button that may be self-explanatory. It might look like a kind of a speech bubble, where you can also ask just general questions that we can try to answer. Or I mean, I think it would be really interesting, building on what Tut just said. I think that's where the first two questions come in, which is, you know, do you do sex on drugs? And if so, do you consider you do chemsex? Because also the word chemsex has all these kind of different I guess affordances or connotations, not just about sex on drugs, but specifically gay men doing sex on drugs, you know, straight people who do sex on drugs.
Might give it a different
I mean, they don't even give it a name. They're just like high and having sex.
Exactly.
You know? So it would be really interesting also to see, what do you need? To see what your answers from that.
Got it.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm not even sure if I'm like passing the slides and you're seeing me pass slides or not.
Nope, nothing's up there.
Yes.
Let me go back.
There we go.
All right. Then
Great.
we have answers.
So we have some answers, which I think, so this is, you had asked about those first two questions, and I think this is an interesting data point here, because of the people who've responded so far, 86% say that they do have sex on drugs, and 13% say no. And it's actually, it's changing. It was more dramatic a minute ago. Stop answering so I can make my point. No. Oh, no, here we go. So at this point, we now have 75% saying they have chemsex and 25% saying they don't. And so you already see there is some kind of gap between the way that the way that we might understand those experiences in a kind of analytic perspective and the way that people live them. And I mean, something else that I think is interesting to think about is the way that chemsex connects to other kinds of body making or world making among queer people, right? There are so many ways in which queer people use substances as kind of technologies of the self, whether that be around, trans folks who are using hormones to play with their gender, to experiment with their gender, whether that be people who are using steroids to change the way that their body looks. There's so many...
But even like recreational drugs, right?
And recreational drugs as well.
There's some really interesting research on chemsex coming out of Australia around how people who identify as non-binary or trans, how they use certain drugs, or how they actually have... how they have given weight to their experiences of drug use, or value their experience of drug use and sex on drugs as part of their kind of production of themselves as, you know, as trans people or...
I think you see this in the Berlin scene quite a lot, and I think over the years, as this type of drug use became more and more, I wouldn't say only popular, but maybe more and more visible and more acceptable in this kind of Berlin clubbing scene, it also became much more acceptable and visible to people, for people to actively play around with their genders, play around with their gender presentation, and kind of do that in a light-hearted way, maybe provided by the club setting and by the drug setting, and grow that into something more real and more sustainable after. I think not only allowing yourself to maybe play around with these gender presentations, but also allowing yourself to experience your community seeing you play around with these, for example, gender presentations. And I think that's also very meaningful to a lot of trans and non-binary people, to see that they are real-time accepted.
And also experience their bodies potentially in different ways.
Yeah,
right?
in a positive way,
yeah.
in a way that is maybe, that is experienced as good in the context, maybe in the context of chemsex as pleasurable, or as having abilities, sexual abilities that are inherently good for the situation. For example, with a lot of fisting parties and this type of context, really allowing people to experience their bodies in a bit of a different way.
Right.
Also more genderless.
And it's interesting, we got a little, we're not projecting it, but we created a little word cloud with the answers to, why do you do it? Someone wrote golf. I mean, I've never played golf, but maybe it's one of the things that you could do on drugs.
Here are some...
But there is an idea of like exploration comes up. What else comes up?
Exploration, less inhibitions, more fun, new kinds of orgasm, partying with friends, community discovery, anxiety around sexuality. One that I think is interesting, and again, just to go back to this conversation that both of you were having earlier about whether people think of like what the difference is, especially as we think about it, between having sex on drugs and chemsex, quote unquote, is that one of the answers is drugs, not chemsex drugs.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it also, I mean, it
really shows you what people are thinking when they think of chemsex, and maybe for a lot of people the idea of, I don't know, doing half a tab of acid with your partner and having some very deep spiritual bonding experience, maybe that's not considered chemsex by a lot of people, even though maybe on an academic level, kind of this blinded equalizing point of view, might just say, yeah, all of this is chemsex just the same.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think it's also part of this idea that, chemsex at the moment is really, it's not just about, sex and drugs, it became a kind of a cultural formation, right? So,
Strong element of maybe pushing the boundaries.
but also
Maybe-
of like identifying with a certain kind of culture that is defined by that practice.
Yeah.
And I think that may be the kind of the difference between, say, earlier forms of drug use, that in queer history and in club history have always happened. And obviously people leave clubs, have sex in clubs, but that was never called chemsex. So chemsex becomes this specific, very kind of darkly defined culture. And then obviously some people will
Yeah.
feel more
Gravitate towards-
comfortable inhabiting that space, and others won't, and that's absolutely, that's fine, because it's,
Yeah, I think also understanding all of these different layers or maybe sub-communities of people having sex on drugs is also very helpful to taking that a step further and seeing in harm reduction work what we can do to address the problems that these sub-communities are having that might not be similar to the problems that other sub-communities, both tagged as chemsex, are having or not having somewhere else.
yeah. So I mean, I think what maybe it would be good to also hear from you as someone who's works on harm reduction, what you think in the kind of the Berlin context, in the Berlin contexts that you've worked on, what you think are the kind of the challenges that people face, or the people that come to you face?
I think what really makes a lot of Berliners similar is that it seems that a lot of people gravitate towards this city because they look for an environment where you can experiment and where you can be rewarded and appreciated by your community for experimenting in that way. But I think there is a strong lack of reinforcing this as a true community, and a lot of times that leaves people feeling a bit empty. And then you look at the drugs that people are attracted to doing in the same times, and you look at what kind of even neurological effects they're having, and you see that G, for example, really works on the same brain areas that help social anxiety. Or you look at meth that works directly on the same brain area that helps reinforce our sense of self. Or you look how like MDMA can give people an ability to see their bodies in without self-judgment.
Right.
And it becomes very, very clear why they are doing them in these spaces, in these contexts. And I think instead of looking just at the drug use and saying what is missing here, what kind of problems this community faces, it would also be very, very meaningful to say, hey, hang on, like, what are people also experiencing positively from these drugs? What
So what
kind
do they
of,
want from it?
what do they want from it, and what is this allowing them to experience? And how do we create spaces or cultures or communities that give them their needs and allow them to keep doing this experimentation in a way that is healthy for them and for their communities, that is growing, and that also allows for the communities to see these these gray areas and say, okay, what's happening where?
And so what do you think, what do you think that would look like? Because you see lots of like information, and there's always this thing around, if only you give information to people, people will just do the right thing. And anyone who knows anything about HIV history, it was not because people knew that condoms existed that people just,
Exactly.
everyone started using them. So there's this gap between, okay, what else is meaningful to people that actually makes them
And I think
not do the choice that health professionals expect you to do.
knowledge is definitely power, and knowledge is definitely the basis on which we have to build, because of course if this isn't accessible and if things are not known by people, then there is really nothing else that we can do. But I think that as important at this point, where knowledge is something that is accessible. We're not in the 90s anymore. We have the internet. Pushing people in a direction of knowledge is already enough. When we look at something that is more worth our energy, maybe we should look at what kind of spaces we are creating, what kind of opportunities we are giving to our community to see itself and build itself and co-create itself as a community, and not just as a party scene, and not just as something that happens in crowded apartments that no one talks about. And I think this is really maybe where the next focus should be, on giving these opportunities, and maybe also on removing whatever barriers people have from doing the best for themselves in the Chemsex context, in the partying context.
I think you're talking about barriers, and I think there's often a barrier because there is a level of, depending where you are, of judgment that people throw, or judgments that people make of one another. And I think maybe one of the issues is that if you feel like you're having a problem with misuse of drugs, or if the drugs that you're doing are having actually a negative impact in your life, how comfortable are people to actually approach a friend or approach someone to talk about it without fear of being like either pushed back and we don't want to kind of hang out with you anymore, or fear of being kind of lectured or judged,
or even just fear of being left aside.
Right.
I think,
right.
and I think that's
Right.
that's a real consequences that a lot of people actually face. So it's not only a fear; it's a bit of knowledge. People know if I stop this kind of extreme use because I know it's not so good for me, without judgment on maybe what it is for my friends, then I won't be invited anymore to the parties, to the hangouts, because people will feel awkward around me, because they will feel like maybe my not doing something is in a way a kind of judgment. And I think the only way to really address that is to help people see the many, many, many different diverse reasons that people do drugs and chemsex, so that they will be able to say on themselves, okay, this time I was doing it because I wanted to experiment with my body and I wanted like a spiritual break from life, but also I was feeling a bit avoidant or suicidal. And be able to see how all these things can play together into one use, or one party, or one chemsex meeting. And only once people can really understand these subtleties can they really sit with their friend and say, hey, listen, I felt we were at this party yesterday and we were all a little, too much, but, I felt some kind of vibe that you were doing it because you needed something. And I think when we are in these gray areas and are able to see our own and others' gray area, then people will feel more comfortable saying, you know what, yeah, I was right, you're right, I was overusing because I felt awkward, I felt socially anxious, I feel depressed lately and like I don't belong. But it has to come out of people seeing first in themselves and also in the people around them that it's not one reason why we do the things we do.
And also that there's no like kind of nice drugs, and I think to me what I encounter a lot is lots of people who do drugs judging other people who do the drugs they don't do.
Yeah.
Right?
The drugs they don't like.
that they don't like, and and if we think a bit about these kinds of histories, actually, the G that you do is not better than the crystal meth that someone else smokes, or worse, it's another drug that works in a different way. But the level of suddenly kind of turning to or switch on of moral judgment on it actually hinders people's ability to actually talk about it.
And it's also very much connected, because you put a moral judgment because you're afraid what you're doing deserves a moral judgment of its own.
Right.
Out of this inability to see that what you're doing
Right.
may be for varied reasons.
And we see it with there's still this myth that for instance, with the history of like coke and crack, that crack is really bad and coke is for the
rich,
the yuppies, 1980s crazy kind of financiers in wherever, but crack is bad. Why is crack bad? because it's cheap and black people are smoking it, because, you know, the difference from one to the other actually is not that much, if you think about it. But, you know, some people, you know, black poor people in the US smoke crack, rich white people do coke. So crack is bad and coke is not. And crystal meth has some kind of similar connotations, right? So I think maybe we should maybe think a bit more about how we even judge one another, even in the scenes that we are in, because we may actually be, you know, pushing forward these same kinds of value judgments that are actually not productive and really problematic, and then we kind of stop ourselves from maybe being helpful.
Yeah, and also in a way, these judgments maybe help us feel like we have a community, because here we are, some people together saying this is allowed, this is not allowed, this is what is in our group, this is what is excluded from our group, and we can feel, okay, we have some meaning, we are bound together by something. But in the end, this is a form of very, very dangerous community building, because then everyone always feels about to be excluded, or in danger of being excluded, or in danger of having not the right opinion, or doing the wrong drug, or whatever.
And having to deal with the drugs and their own drug use on their own.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
So maybe, what would you tell Giacomo and Giovanni, that as people who organize parties, what would you like to see in the party scene in Berlin?
I mean, I think already this is the direction that a lot of parties are going to, and maybe especially parties that are going to still be here for the next 10 years and maybe even longer, is to understand that you have to really create a space for your community to do their thing. And that is the biggest thing that anyone can do as a culture curator of any kind, is to be able to understand who is needing, whose point of view is most important to the times, and give those people a place to feel comfortable in and to thrive in. And I think this will really be, in the next years, a lot of empowering the community to feel like a community, and to come out and to participate as a community, not just as a consumer. Yeah, and really maybe co-create the space in a way that is more active, that maybe even we can't really imagine right now what that would look like, but that even that process needs to be co-created by all of us, to see what would a party look like, what would a space look like if it's constantly made by the people who use it and need it. Yeah.
What we have in...
We have a couple questions from the audience, and I think maybe now would be a good time to turn to them. So the first question we have here is, you referred to Chemsex and how it connects people and gives them an opportunity to feel related to one another. And someone asks, isn't it the same to go out and drink alcohol? Isn't it the same to go out and smoke cigarettes? Like, aren't these things all the same? And my sense is that both of you are going to say yes, but...
I mean, yes and no. I haven't, you know what, actually I've seen people bond around cigarettes. Maybe when I was 14 or 13, there was a strong bond around smoking cigarettes.
I mean, I smoked behind the gym in school.
Exactly. So,
you know?
Yeah. I mean, there is definitely something bonding about engaging in taboo together, or doing something that is at the edge together.
I mean, I think there's a kind of I mean, I'm not sure if it's smoking. There is a kind of a ongoing cultural thing. You know, some people call it edge work, which is, you know, this kind of tendency to experience limit situations, right? And, you know, some people bungee jump, some people do G on the dance floor. But these anyway, it's a long practice, right, in different cultures, in different histories, this kind of attempt to see, you know, where does my body and where does my kind of consciousness kind of go? You know, where can I take it?
And the edge experience is bound to be bonding for the people who engage in it in a way, because it is very, in that sense, I would say, unique.
Yeah, and you know, the question of alcohol is also interesting because, again, the way in which chemsex has been framed as a gay, as predominantly cis gay male practice of doing specific drugs, but no one ever talks about,
Straight people
drunk
getting
straight
hammered
people,
on alcohol.
drunk straight
yeah.
people having sex, right? Right?
Yeah.
Which I believe happens a lot.
Happens a lot, and it's
I
very
don't-
big in. Watch any
it's very
reality
big
show, and it's
in
very
America.
glorified. Let's put some straight people together, give them a bunch of alcohol, and see what happens.
It's very, you're right. I think it's a very big phenomenon that we should also think about, and maybe.
Maybe they need to explore that as a type of chemsex as well.
Yeah, I know. I think the kind of the naming of chemsex, and maybe we didn't talk much about it, but the actual naming of chemsex brings it into being as something, right, that concerns a particular kind of people. So it's also a problem calling it that. Obviously, it helps us think about it. It helps us as kind of a group of people think about it and find strategies to deal with it. But it also is another kind of label put on, like a fear-mongering story laid on us. Yeah, I mean, yes, it's the answer I would give. To different extents, right? To different extents. But I think edge work and edge work practices and like intense experiences have always been part of who we are, and curiosity about that has always been part of who we are. Perhaps for queer people, then that kind of all comes together as, part of this moment where you're kind of trying, not so much to like discover yourself, because I don't really like the idea of like discovering something that is hidden, but like making yourself.
Yeah, creating.
Like
I would say
creating
definitely
yourself.
creating.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
So we have two questions, or maybe several questions to the audience, but two that I want to put together here, because I think they make an interesting pair. So one person asks how, I think, reacting to the way in which in this conversation both of you have been reluctant to distinguish between different drugs. You're kind of talking about substances plus sex all together, and the ways in which maybe some of the conversations that we have where these different substances are thought about in really different ways aren't helpful. But someone asks, how do you not distinguish between those substances when they do have different chemical properties? When some are more addictive and some are not? When they do different things to us? And then the related question that came in is, aren't we, by focusing on the ways in which this kind of substance use creates community, potentially glorifying substance use or encouraging it, or encouraging behavior that's maybe destructive or self-destructive? And so I think those questions make an interesting potential pairing for both of you to kind of respond to.
On the question of course, these substances are kind of obviously very differently, kind of pharmacologically. On the matter of addiction,
I think with chemsex, the addiction becomes a lot of the time to the act itself more than to a certain drug. And I would say that in Berlin specifically, there seems to be an attraction to the mix of drugs as the drug that is done, and not specifically to one certain drug where we could say, okay, this is the culture pit, let's get G out of clubs, and then this behavior of pushing yourself to the limit and seeing like what you can bring from this confused state will suddenly be gone with G. So it's not so simple as to say it's this or that drug. On the other hand, it is interesting to look at the choice of drugs as symbolizing what people feel that they need. I think definitely the high use of G shows us that people feel socially anxious and awkward and need some kind of support. And I don't know what this means about how the party would have to look to create a place where people feel like they have this kind of support, but it definitely means, okay, this is why this is the drug of the time, because people want to feel comfortable being themselves, and G creates that experience somehow much, much, much easier.
I would say on addiction that, I mean, that's, again, there's obviously also kind of different positions on this, but I tend to take the position that, yes, some drugs can potentially have more addictive properties, but addiction is not just explained by the drug that you take, right? Addictive behavior is really complex, and lots of us drink alcohol, a lot of alcohol. Others have an issue with alcohol and are alcoholic, right? And I think if we just isolate specific drugs as causes of behavior or as causes of problems, we actually giving a kind of get out of jail free card to contexts, to environments, to kind of cultures of consumption, and to one another as well, right?
I think
Lots of people do G and don't have a problem with it. Lots of people smoke crystal meth and don't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
And yes, if we don't bring in the cultural aspect of these things, how are people doing it? Why are people doing it? What is meaningful to them? What is the kind of social and kind of cultural and economic environment where they are kind of situated? You'll never be able to address the problem, so just blame the substance and then get highly, problematic policing of drug use and kind of authoritarian policing of drug use.
And this goes also directly to the glorification. If we don't speak about how it's really done in a way that people who do it talk about it, then we're never going to have real answers about the how and about the how to keep these communities, our communities, ourselves, safe. So I think there is a lot of talk already about the dangers, and if that was enough, then we would see our communities thriving now that this information about the danger is out there. But we don't see that direct link, and that's because something else is missing here. And that something has to do with being able to look at the type of use that people are doing directly and name it for what it is, positive and negative.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great book by a British sociologist called Faye Dennis. It's called Injecting Bodies into More Than Human Worlds or something like that. And she's a sociologist, so it's lots of kind of interview and data, quantitative and qualitative data from research done in the UK with drug users and health professionals. And she really takes an issue with both the kind of criminalization of drug use but also with the kind of dominant paradigms in healthcare, which still tend to kind of associate misuse of drugs or problematic drug use with something about the person that needs to be healed. Mm-hmm. So the
pathologization.
Say it for me, babes.
Pathologization.
That word, pathologization of drug use, then again completely disconnects the person from the environments where they are and tries to kind of address it on them. And she comes up with this amazing notion that she calls more than harm reduction. So it's not just about harm reduction, it's about more than harm reduction. And what she means by that is that we really need to value and respect what is positive that people take from these experiences and ensure that they can continue to take those, explore and even enhance those positive experiences of drug use while making sure they kind of mitigate negative or like kind of self-hindering experiences.
And that's very important to the individuals
use.
themselves, but also to all of us as a community, as a humanity. I mean, if we don't allow for people who belong to minorities or who have identities that are somehow marginalized or special or unique to do this kind of experimentation, then we lose out on innovation, then we lose out on our ability to push culture and progress slowly forward. And I think that is one of our biggest sources of magic that we have in the queer community, is this ability for innovation, is this ability to kind of see into the future and feel the things before they happen, because our identities allow us for a different point of view.
Yeah.
Speaking of that creative magic, I think this next question builds off of it. And I'll also just say we have about probably 10, 15 minutes max more to keep talking. So I have a couple more questions on the list, but if you have any, send them in now so that we can make sure to get to everything that comes in if you're thinking of something and haven't asked it yet. But the next question is maybe about this past year and the way this past year has challenged us to be creative in how we've had to learn sort of new ways of being together and socializing and keeping sane and also somewhat safe. And the question was how the past year, how the pandemic has changed chemsex practices in Berlin specifically, and I think this would be a great question for you to start off on because you.
I mean, I think there's a few parts to this answer. I think first of all, I would have to say that maybe it's widened what we would say as chemsex practices in Berlin. I think maybe before the pandemic we'd say, okay, chemsex is much more of a meth, G as well, but a meth kind of direction. It's something that happens in maybe a bit of an older community, maybe in less of our neighborhoods.
Schöneberg.
Exactly, more Schöneberg. And I think with the pandemic, suddenly people had not so many other options. It became kind of chemsex or bust. And this led a lot of people to mix in with maybe communities that they wouldn't before, which I have to say maybe is not so much a bad thing. I think like there's definitely some hipsters in Neukölln that saw people over 50 for the first time in their life. And I mean, I do think that it led to this kind of like maybe a more diverse kind of house party scene, but it also led a lot of people to more extreme forms of drug use because suddenly you're at home, so you're a little more safe, but maybe you're a little bit feeling also more safe, even though you shouldn't be.
And you're also bored.
You're also bored. You're also seeking out some kind of relief, some kind of bonding moment with someone. And I think this means that a lot of people maybe pushed their limits a little bit, did a little bit more, tried drugs that they wouldn't have in other situations perhaps, or maybe just even people that suddenly found themselves sucked into this kind of chemsex house party scene, going to party day after day just because they didn't have anything else to do. So, yeah.
You know what, it's interesting as well, Christian Moller, works a lot on chemsex and the internet, has done some work recently about the pandemic and chemsex use, or actually chemsex chat rooms online, which apparently saw a massive boom during the pandemic, where people are just at home smoking meth mostly, but on like kind of live video
like
chat,
on Zoom.
like on Zoom, but Zoom no, because Zoom kind of the algorithm cuts it specific.
Well, not on Zoom.
Specific other
Skype.
other platforms. And it's still sexualized, so there's rules about, you cannot have clothes on, everyone can only smoke one by one so that everyone looks at the person smoking, etc. So you cannot all smoke at the same time, so there's a choreography to that. But that stuff also kind of developed during the pandemic, and you could say they were being good people, they were not meeting other people, they were not potentially getting COVID, they were kind of still smoking together, smoking meth together, maybe kind of having a little wank, if they could, but then, still craving that same kind of sociability.
Mm-hmm. And then this, I think this will actually be the last question, and I think it's actually a really good place to end as we wrap up a conversation about substances and queer bodies and move into a conversation or a series of films about, and then eventually a conversation about kind of plasticity and gender and different kinds of queer bodies and the variety of queer bodies that exist in a city like Berlin. And this is about how we as a community might address the question of exclusion when it comes to chemsex practices, especially the question asks about class and gender and race and looks. Yeah. But given the extent to which chemsex parties are private, given the extent to which these things are invitation-based and takes place behind closed doors, what are some of the ways in which these dynamics maybe play out in these spaces, and what are some of the things that we can do as a community to potentially address them?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest, and certainly one of the issues that come up quite a lot around access, around invitation, around how are the different event structured, who runs the party, who invites, what are the kind of the what you need to send in order to be invited, but also, who's paying for the drugs?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that also plays a lot into, do you have drugs on you? Then maybe even if you're a bit like, maybe if you're not white and maybe if you're not like, don't have the kind of body that I like, but maybe if you bring drugs, maybe you can come in. So I think that economy is really interesting to think about, because it's certainly both a space of like, idealized acceptance, I think, but it's also one that is highly policed at the door.
Mm-hmm.
And again, but you can say the same about dark rooms and sex clubs and saunas, to a certain extent.
I think, like a lot of other things also, this is a question that we're going to need to start learning to give back to the community. I think we're at a moment, this very pivotal moment, where we need to stop making up ideas how to solve other people's problems, and we need to start asking those people what they feel their problem is and how we can solve it. And I think when we do that, maybe we'll see a lot of these creative possible answers coming up, such as people saying, I don't know, I want a Chemsex workshop to help me navigate things better and have better tools to know my own body, for example. Or maybe we'll have people saying, you know what, send me a box of condoms and needles. Let me just log online and get it sent to my home. This is what I need. I don't need anything else. We need to start talking to the people and asking them in a true non-judgmental manner what they need. And then we just need to do those things. And that's right about chemsex, and it's right about racism in clubs. It's right about trans and queer bodies in clubs. We need to start talking to our own communities and to our own public and just asking. Yeah.
I mean, I think that sounds like a great way to finish.
Yeah, I think so too.
This thing.
So thank you so much, Tut, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That was really good to hear from you. We will now play.
There we go.
It's supposed to be a video installation. We'll play it for a while we get drinks, use the toilet, etc. It's a video video installation by LA-based artist Castles, and just very briefly is a kind of documentation of the work that they went through with their bodies, with their body, not more than one, with their body, to both through kind of bodybuilding, but also kind of eating diet, in order to kind of really explore what their body could become, and kind of in terms of like gender expression, I guess.
Yeah, so we'll play that for about 20 minutes, and then we will come back for a screening series and then another conversation. So
just responses to the films, not like a big conversation.
just some responses. So enjoy. Thank you so much. And here comes the art.